Let me welcome you to the forum of Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government tonight, and it's a special pleasure for me as dean to welcome back to Harvard this year's Class Day speaker, Congressman Robert Torricelli, an MPA in the class of 1981. The theme of this year's graduation activities is public service. Public service is this school's reason for being. Tomorrow we will host a panel here in this forum at 4:30, remembering Robert Kennedy's call to public service on what is essentially his 20th anniversary of his assassination. And the subject of our speaker tonight is consistent with this theme, the ethics of public service. As you know, the Class Day exercise is organized by the student group here at the school, and the Class Day speaker is selected by the students themselves through a committee consisting of representatives from the 3 graduating classes and the class marshals. The criteria include commitment to public service, excellence in the professional field, and oratorical ability. Tonight's speaker excels in all 3 categories. But more than that, he's an example of the enthusiasm in public leadership that we here at the Kennedy School try to foster. Obviously, it's a little difficult to take full credit for an extraordinary career on the basis of 1 year spent here at the Kennedy School, as much as Time magazine would make it that we try. Nonetheless, Mr. Torricelli, we will admit, did have some political experience before he came to the Kennedy School. After completing his A.B. at Rutgers, he served first as an assistant to the governor and then as executive director of the Democratic Party in his home state of New Jersey. He then served as counsel to Vice President Mondale. Still, it's worth noting that neither his B.A. or his J.D. or that experience seemed to have, at that point, inspired him to run for office in a way that his period at the Kennedy School and his Kennedy School MPA, we hope, did. Now in his 3rd term as a representative from the 9th District of New Jersey, Bob is already making his mark in Congress. His wide-ranging foreign policy interests include Southern Africa, the Philippines, the Persian Gulf, and the Middle East. Newsweek magazine has named him one of the 3 congressional members to have made the most significant contributions to the quest for peace in the Middle East. In addition to his vocal role on the Committee on Foreign Affairs, Mr. Torricelli is also a member in the Committee of Science, Space, and Technology, and has been particularly active in drafting toxic waste Superfund legislation. His work on both committees has been recognized in U.S. News & World Report, which included him among the 15 Democrats who it named, quote, the rising stars of American politics. While a long history of public leadership is one indicator of Bob's commitment to public service, he's gone much further, promoting programs that encourage others to pursue public service. He was here in the forum just a year ago with a forum event that focused on an activity that he's been involved in as both a supporter and a sponsor of legislation to establish universal national service here in the United States, and 2 of his bills are currently in committee. It's therefore a very great honor to welcome back to the school a graduate as our Class Day speaker, Bob Torricelli.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dean, and to members of the Kennedy School family. I am indeed very grateful to be invited here today. 8 years ago, upon my own graduation from the Kennedy School, I was unable to attend. I was also working in the Carter re-election campaign and eager to be a part of the second Carter administration. I didn't want to lose a chance to work in that last primary, which gives evidence to the fact that for whatever else the Kennedy School did for me, it did not help my political perceptions of winners and losers. Something finally proven this year when I began the campaign season as Gary Hart's congressional coordinator. Eight years ago, however, when I did leave this school, I had a belief that I had gained some skills, met some people, found some purposes and perhaps a message that would allow me to serve and to seek public office. And for whatever else that year did, it has in these years in Congress made all the difference. And for that, I am indeed very grateful to the school. Last week, Dean Allison called me and asked me for a title for my remarks. I frankly hadn't thought about it, and I didn't know how to answer, so I did what I always used to do in the Kennedy School when I didn't know the answer to a question. I made something up. What I made up is that I wanted to talk about ethics and national service. Well, I do. But I also want to talk about something more. I want to talk about the future. And I've used this speech and the few moments we're going to spend together tonight as an excuse to think about it. Beyond the day-to-day activities of the Congress or the legislation that's before us at any moment. And think with you as one who shares with many of you the perceptions of a generation about having been in this school, having given some of our lives to public service, where it is we're headed, and what it is that service is all about. 26 years ago, the man whose name borne by this school spoke in Berkeley. And he quoted Prince Bismarck, who noted that 1/3 of the students of Germany were broken from their work, 1/3 were dissipated, and the third that remained would surely rule the nation. By virtue of the fact that you have survived this experience, remained until this day, and even appeared on this evening, I think we can say with some confidence, you've got the interest, you've got the ability, you've got the drive, that your hands are going to touch and in some way help to shape the American future. Not the future of next month, your first year in Washington or Albany or Sacramento, or if you're fortunate, Trenton. I want to talk to you about a new century, something that is addressed more, but needs to be addressed by those of you who are preparing to serve in it. It's a time when our generation, with our own strength of experiences and the applications of our own values and the pursuit of our own ambitions, are going to come to leadership in America. Not participate in it, not be a part of it, but the graduates of this school, indeed perhaps of this school more than any other, are going to help to lead this country. Time that once seemed so distant, a new century, now closer to us than most of the events that helped to shape our own generation, closer than Vietnam, closer than Watergate, closer by half than the assassinations that for many of us punctuated the end of our own adolescence. A new century, America's third. But first, it's going to be governed by a generation that's fundamentally different than the America that has grown to know. Born to the latter half of this very century. Born to a time when prosperity was assured and assumed. When atomic weapons and means of mass destruction were a part of everyday policy. For the first time, when America's leadership in the world is something that we were born to and have come to accept. How these experiences translate into the policies that we as a generation are going to help to define and to implement, the policies that we'll write and leave for another generation, is not only difficult but probably impossible to describe. But if 50 years of American world leadership provides us with anything, if the conclusion of this, the first American century, affords us one quality different from those who preceded us, it has to be this: the single, the unique ability, the confidence to see America as she is. A quality of candor about who we are, where we've come from, what we've achieved, and what we haven't. And understanding that doubting America and questioning her, challenging her, finding those things that we have done right, but also, more importantly, understanding the need to identify those things that we have not, is an expression of concern, the highest kind, the highest element of national devotion. In the Soviet Union today, they call it glasnost. In America, in our generation, I hope in a new century, it isn't going to be a lot different. It needs to be a simple honesty about who we are and where we failed. It is, in fact, not new for our country. 50 years ago, when a different generation began its march to American leadership, Franklin Roosevelt spoke to our country and said that he saw a nation one-third ill-housed, one-third ill-fed, and unemployed. It wasn't a simple admission of failure, but it was a statement of fact, a simple assessment of where we were and who we were, what separated us from a more perfect society. It was a painful process then, and it will be for us too, but it's a hopeful one for all of us who are prepared to follow those admissions with real commitments in our careers. It's a process of facing realities. It's a process of understanding that today in America, there's an America not only that is not seen and not served, but not even admitted. In America today, in our cities, the chances of our own young, the children of America, surviving the first years of their own lives, as measured by infant mortality, those odds are worse than they are in some of the emerging nations of Latin America, and worse than in every other industrialized nation on earth. In America today, where 40 million people possess no health care, and on a daily basis, without insurance, make judgments between the rent, their food, and the providing of basic medical care to their children. Where rates of inoculation for our children, even while science advances the things that we can cure, the diseases we can solve, and pushes the edge of human knowledge, inoculation rates are falling. And every year, 1 million American families end their relationships, file for divorce or bankruptcy because of the costs of mounting medical care for catastrophic illnesses. And where indeed 50 million functioning illiterates seek to deal with life in a modern economy. There are problems within our reach, problems that can be solved, but problems nevertheless that are real, and problems that define who we are and speak more about us than any conquest, any discovery, any other element of ourselves or our culture that we seek to leave behind. Each may represent a failure of a program, perhaps, a frustration with something that we have sought to do during these years, as an element of some administration and some program. But more than that, they speak to us, and us as a people. Illness when there is no cure, exposure when there is no shelter, and hunger when there is no food. These are not new. They are acts of God, they are timeless, and they are tragic. But today they are different. For hunger, illness, and homelessness in a land of bounty is an offense to God. And in our time, it must become to be accepted that it is also a violation of the most basic of human rights. In a new century, under the leadership of this generation, our generation, I hope that we can revisit the defining of basic rights in America in just as real and as just a fundamental sense as we did 200 years ago defining our rights as Americans to be as relevant to our times as the rights of speech and assembly and religion were in the face of a British monarch in whose denial our own vital liberties were born. Internationally, I suppose that the need for a new honesty is just as real, because no matter how selfless our people have been, and they have, and no matter how great our sacrifices as a people for the world, and they have been great, or how noble those causes, we need to confront the simple reality of our relations with the world today. America is leading an alliance in this century where few are following, and less share our view of our own security or theirs. We are the product of a revolution, but America is the one nation where change is an element of our own culture. But to those who have little and want something, to those who seek freedom and have none, America, incredibly, is seen as a defender of the past, the preserver of the status quo. America, I was told by one Greek student a few years ago, believes in defending freedom. If it is freedom for America, that is at issue. Our good intentions or the error of the world's perceptions, and they are an error, are of no solace. Identifying America with the aspirations of the many, rather than defending the interests of the few, is the first obligation in correcting American foreign policy. America's role as the world's principal advocate of challenge and change is our one great asset in leadership, our one great gift as a new prevailing power, and it has to be restored and recognized for the value that it holds. It is, more than anything else, a renewal of our confidence, restoring our belief that our values are a weapon in our own arsenal, understanding that while competition with the Soviets may persist, indeed it will in this generation as in the last of American leadership, that confrontation alone neither defines all friendships nor explains all issues. If there were no Soviet Union, there would still be poor people in Central America who fought for a better life. If there were no Soviet Union, there would still be blacks in South Africa who wanted freedom for their own land. And in each of those cases and more, be there a Soviet Union or be there not, America would still be required to take a stand, dictated not only by the practical politics of the day, but understanding that our own security and our future allied with identifying the hopes of each of those people. These are the realities of our own time, different perhaps by one more exception, one more element that is going to make your time in leadership different. The world is no longer waiting for America to decide. Certainly as our generation shall exercise leadership, we are also going to share it in this world. This month, Congress votes on a minimum wage. It's an exciting issue. It's an important issue. It was an issue for our parents' time. It was an issue of 1933. It was a question that was settled more than a generation ago. And yet today, this week, next week, on the floors of Congress, it will dominate discussion. Soon, catastrophic health care is going to be debated, and later it is going to be daycare in this session of Congress. And they are critical issues. Issues that were debated, decided upon, implemented in Europe and Japan 30, 25, and 40 years ago. These are not issues that should be decided today in 1988 by a people who have more fundamental choices. They're issues of the past that need to be accepted, become part of our country, and put behind us. There simply isn't that kind of time remaining. The future of education in America, as in each of these issues, needs to be redefined. We can't talk about education in our time in terms of whether it deserves a 2% or a 5% increase, or a 2 or 3% reduction in any fiscal year. Education has to be seen differently. Can a nation that ranks 17th among the industrialized world in the testing of basic skills of our children have school end at 2:30 in the afternoon? Or rely on local property taxes to fund education? Or give our children 3 months off for summer vacation? When we all understand that our country can't compete and is falling behind? It isn't that we're debating the wrong issue in education. It's the scale of our thinking is so wrong. And that at this point we do not have the luxury of time, because the world is not waiting for America to decide that her problems are real or that they can be addressed. Struggle to decide decent health care in America is more than the annual debate over whether or not we need a cost of living adjustment for Medicare or Social Security. In a time of limited assets, with real limits on what we can spend, it's much more fundamental. It's the question that our country spends $150 billion a year in medical payments, and yet a third of all that money is going to prolong the last 60 or 90 days of life, leaving too little for those in the beginning of life, or those who can still contribute to life. It's a question of the fact of whether or not a nation has a future that spends $18 for every person over 65, for every $1 it spends for its citizens under 18. Those are fundamental choices. Not COLAs, not minor adjustments, not what new interests can be served, but fundamental questions. Fundamental questions that are being addressed elsewhere and need to be addressed here. Finally, in drug abuse, it's not a question, as we're going to hear in this presidential campaign, about who can prescribe a longer prison term for the same dealer, who can be tougher with what foreign dictator. That's not being honest with drug abuse or what it's doing to this country. It requires an honest acceptance that an American child with a good family, a decent education, a real future, simply doesn't seek to escape reality. Do more than seize the drugs. Raise the question of the world of a child will face when they're off their high, when the drugs are gone, what it is they see in the morning, and what prospect or hope it is that keeps them from returning to drugs again. That may not be the campaign issue, but you know and I know that's the question before the country. Therein is the difference that I hope that a new generation, our generation, can make in a new time. These are the issues of fundamental, deep, and indeed even structural change in America. I believe this country's ready to follow. Indeed, I'm convinced they are. Americans have been waiting for years. 17 years ago in boarding school, I worked each afternoon as a tutor in an Hispanic neighborhood in Newburgh, New York. And as a part of my routine of speaking English in my own broken Spanish, I would ask my students to recite the names of the President and the Vice President of the United States. And one day, when a young woman revealed that she didn't know the name of the President, I could hardly believe what it was I was hearing, until someone else suggested there was a reason. It wasn't relevant to her life. And it wasn't. This year, half of all Americans will vote. Half won't. They didn't forget. They didn't overlook it. No matter what Mr. Jackson or Mr. Dukakis or Mr. Bush may say about electoral reform, it isn't a problem of electoral laws. They're making a statement. By their not voting, they're making a statement about the relevance of the debate and the system and perhaps the candidates. Each of those votes not cast is a deafening message. A deafening message for anyone here who chooses to hear it about where our country is going and whether those in need, those who represent much of the future of this society, feel that they any longer believe in it or identify with its structures and its powers and its answers with their own future. Perhaps America, perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps it won't respond to all that I ask. I don't know. But no one's going to know if America's not challenged. No one is going to know just how great the potential of this country is if someone doesn't offer that challenge. If someone doesn't come forward and not ask Americans simply what they're prepared to spend, but what are you prepared to do? Does the fact that we have real fiscal limits, that we can't hire all the teachers, can't send doctors into all the neighborhoods, can't tutor all the kids, can't provide legal aid to all those in need, does that define the limits of what this country is? Or is the limit something else? The question of going to Americans and say to them, we can't meet the price in dollars, but you can give your time. You can give us a hand. We'll give you the means by which you can donate and offer yourself as part of the answer. And when that isn't enough, be frank with them as well and say these are the costs, but here's what it means to your country. Twice in my lifetime, I have seen governors of my state face a certain electoral defeat because they went to the voters with a simple proposition. It's going to cost you more, but here's what it means to the education of your children. Not only did each not lose, they were returned with the largest landslides in my state's political history. It's the difference of courage. It's the difference of vision. It's the difference of understanding, as Bobby Kennedy said 20 years ago. The future is not a gift. It is an achievement. It is earned by each and every new generation. That is our challenge. Walter Lippmann also said, at a point of great change in America as well, there's nothing for nothing anymore. You took the good things for granted, and now you must earn them again. In America today, there are no great accumulated national reserves. We earned them for 100 years by our trade surpluses. We spent them in 7. There is no great wealth any longer of the greatest educated population on earth that can afford to put aside investments in its education because we did so much in the past. These things we do not have any more to bank upon. But I think you, I know I, would have it no other way, because how far we now go as a country and as a generation is a question not of what was given to us, but what, as Bobby Kennedy said, we earn anew. We can define this American future. Not something that's imposed upon us, but something that we can shape with our own hands. Understand how far it can go. 15 years ago, if an American president had come to the American people and said, we are facing a long, inevitable, and indeterminate dependence on foreign oil in America, the American people would say no. Show us another way. Show us an independence. Today, American ships patrol the Persian Gulf. I'm proud of them. They've done a good job. You should be proud of them. But think about the change in America. Think about the change when we vote upon a new sanctions bill on South Africa and we say there'll be no new investment. There'll be no new flights. There'll be no new bank loans. But by the way, we need the titanium and the cobalt. Think about how different it can be for us to say to the American people again, this is how tough it is. This is what it's going to require. But we're going to do it. We're going to have that independence. We're going to pay that price. I don't know whether the American people will respond, but I know we haven't tried because we haven't challenged them. And I think that's the difference. And so to each of you, I hope that in our time, if it can be different, if it can be better, and it can be both, we are going to define, we are going to set the limits on the American future in our hands, not by what the American people are promised, but by what they're willing to accept that we propose. Make that the difference. Challenge America. And when she meets that challenge, challenge her again. Challenge her in each and every decision that you propose, wherever it is you go in government. And you'll know that you've reached your limits when the people say no, not when we decide that they're not prepared to do more and to make this country everything that it can be. A new century. It's going to see each and every one of you in some way leading, shaping, changing this country. It's exciting. And I'm all the more pleased here tonight, hoping, if the voters renominated me 45 minutes ago in New Jersey, that we're going to be doing it together. Thank you all very much for having me tonight, and good luck. Thank you very much. I'd really love to, yeah. I'd love to. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. And it's the Bobby Kennedy quote I forgot.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Congressman Torselli is willing to take some counter-arguments or questions or a little bit of discussion here. So why don't we open it up for a few minutes, and then after that we're going to have a reception that the Alumni Association is hosting. But the floor is open. You can use one of the microphones, or I think if you'll speak loudly, if you're back there, you can just raise your question. We'll start there.
Well, you provided me the perfect opportunity to discuss my favorite idea for America, one that I was borrowed from Bobby Kennedy, revised by Gary Hart pre-Miami, and kept alive by some of us. And it's universal national service. It's going to happen in America. It's going to come. Let me tell you why and what I think it means for the question that you posed. I suppose that if there had been no Second World War and there had been no draft, my father would have raised his family in the Bronx as his father before him, and I would be entering a primary today for Mario Biaggi's seat in the Congress. But it didn't happen that way. Because for everything else that the draft represented, the calling upon Americans of all walks of life and ethnic groups from all regions of the country, for whatever else it did, it asked everyone to come forward to see this country and touch it and participate in it and take a share in it. Some of us have proposed to do that again, but in a different way. To say to all the American people, you've got a lifetime to give to yourselves. But after you've given 4 years to high school, or 4 years to college, or 3 years to law school, or 2 years to the Kennedy School, pick a year. Take a time, everybody, and give 1 year to this country. Everybody can do something. You can work in a veterans hospital, you can serve in the military, you can join the Peace Corps, you can tutor in an urban school. And you can do it before you get your education, or you can do it after. But you can do it. I'm the product of a public law school. I went to law school for $1,800 a year at Rutgers. Didn't cost the state that. Costed a lot more. That means that the average taxpayer in my state who makes $18,000 or $19,000 a year and is a blue-collar worker worked hard and paid his or her taxes to give me a professional education. Whether or not we have universal service or not, and I think we should, I think the first step is that each of these institutions has a right to go to them and say, we did it for you. Now I'd like to see you in Newark for 9 months in a legal aid clinic. And you who got your $50,000 and $100,000 medical education, we've got a medical clinic for pregnant mothers, for the newborn, and we'd like you to work there for 6 months or for a year. How do you have Americans who drive on the freeways and occasionally glance down at the cities below understand what's happening in America? How do you let them know that the facts that I gave you here are real? Something that wouldn't be believed by 1 in 100 Americans? You get their hands on the problems. You ask them to touch the country. That's what universal service is. I've got legislation in to do that, and every time I write a letter on it to my colleagues, somebody says to me, that is a very good idea. And I really hope that happens in our country. And if I ever hear from people at home that that's what they want, I'm going to be right on that bill. But I understand electoral fears, but I've never been to a high school, never gone to a college, to the same people who would have to give that year. They've told me they didn't like the idea or wouldn't do it. The people who are doubting it are the people who don't have the courage to ask, not the people who need to respond. Universal national service. I think it has a lot to do with answering your question.
I was wondering, would that include work in religious bodies, like say monasteries, or something along that line, or would it just be civil?
Well, I think that's a door we need not go through.
Here's a question in the front row.
You tell us that America needs to be willing to make the hard choices and to make sacrifices for what it believes is right. It's a very inspiring message. But on the other hand, it seems to me very similar to what John Kennedy said when he pledged in 1961 that we would pay any price and bear any burden and so forth and so on. And we spent the next 14 years in Vietnam. It seems to me that the conservatism that's enforced by being short-sighted sometimes keeps us out of a lot of messes. So how do we choose the fights that we want to fight, and how do we endure Vietnam?
Well, let me answer it domestically first, and then I will internationally. If you see the Great Society as a continuum of the commitments that John Kennedy began, and if you will share that language of paying any price and bearing any burden to the national commitments that we made from Vietnam, perhaps, but also to Head Start and Medicaid and Medicare, we did pay any price and bear any burden. And while the American people may have tired of it, it made a lasting and fundamental change in this country. At the time those words were spoken, and in the years that followed, and Lyndon Johnson came to deliver the challenge in the specifics, 60% of the elderly in this country were living in poverty. Today, it's a fraction. The numbers of who we reached with illiteracy, we've cut illiteracy in the nation in half in those years. We changed the lives of millions. That progress stopped. But before it did, before these trends began, we changed the whole face of this country. My suggestion to you tonight is that maybe Americans wanted a rest. Maybe they needed it. Maybe we weren't running the programs right. Maybe they weren't efficient. Maybe we weren't reaching those. Maybe we weren't describing them right. But I don't think the basic character of the American people that responded to that message has basically changed. Conservatism, yes. But no one will ever convince me that these aren't decent, caring people in this country who will respond. Internationally, the result of the policies that you described in your question was a nation that came to leadership in 1945 in the world unsuspecting, unasking, and unprepared. We made some fundamental problems, fundamental mistakes in America coming to leadership. Some of them I tried to describe. We saw every contest in the world, every challenge only in terms of East and West. And the most grievous of all those who shared our enemies were our friends. And it led us not to understand how to use power. It isn't any different than someone who becomes 13 and all of a sudden sees they've got a new height, they've got a new muscle, and they've got a new role in the schoolyard. That doesn't mean you have the wisdom to know how to use it. I think that's changed. I know it's changed in my party, where we talk about the rules for the application of American military power. We're prepared to use them. The weapons that just drove the Soviets out of Afghanistan didn't go there in a package from Ronald Reagan. They came because Democrats in the Congress wanted to know why Red Eye, why Stinger missiles weren't going to them. And then we forced it down Ronald Reagan's throat that we wanted him to have the best because we believed in the cause. The aid of funding the guerrillas in Cambodia didn't come from Ronald Reagan either. Steve Solars and I offered that amendment because it met our criteria, that we identified with the values of the people who were fighting. We believed they were committed to their own cause. We believed that their success was in our interest, and we believed they could win. I think America approaches its military power today with a new maturity, a new set of values, and particularly in a Democratic administration, a new responsibility. I think that finally John Kennedy's message has a new meaning to it.
You mentioned economic independence before as one of the values that you were pursuing. You think that capital and attaining must be a good idea, but it's a very often turned into protectionism, especially from your party.
The questions that I was citing was one in a difference of approach, in whether a twin approach to challenging the American people, where I think we've turned a corner, where the Reagan administration in this instance accepted a limit on the American people, that we wouldn't accept the higher prices, we wouldn't accept the investment, we wouldn't accept the challenge of seeking alternatives. What Richard Nixon and Jerry Ford and Jimmy Carter each said, we'll bear any burden, we'll pay any price. If I can put John Kennedy and Richard Nixon's words, God forgive me, that the change there was that instead we were accepting our limits, which I thought was unnecessary. I'm not talking about protectionism. I'm talking about a different way of seeing the world and rising to challenges of science and of having to make sacrifices rather than seeing them all in military terms. However, having raised protectionism, let me address it just for a moment. No doubt, between now and November, George Bush and Ronald Reagan will tie a protectionist ring around the Democrats' throat 1,000 times. The trade legislation that we offered isn't protectionist. It's reality. America's economy is fully integrated, increasingly fully integrated with the world. That means that certain structural changes need to take place in America if we're to compete. Before I ran for Congress, I practiced law with Walter Mondale, and we represented the Boeing on occasion and sometimes Westinghouse. And when I would go abroad with some of those products, people who haven't given me a dime since, and when I would try to sell those products for a good Republican law firm, we always had the best price on our aircraft. We certainly had the best quality, but we never had the best finance. American companies today are not just losing to foreign corporations, they're losing to foreign governments. That means structural change. Our trade bill increased the ability of private industry to work with government, from everything from job training to the advantages of refinancing to financing their products abroad. We've made a choice. We want full, fair, open international trade. But that means you've got to change some elements of our domestic economy. It also means that free and open markets abroad aren't going to happen because we wish for it to be so. There isn't probably anybody politically aware in America today who wouldn't describe Dick Gephardt's amendment as protectionist, believing that it was going to close American markets. It was exactly the opposite. What we said to foreign nations is, sell your products. Where you can beat us, beat us. We want the highest quality goods in America. We want this to be a market second to none. But the price of entry into this free, fair, and open market is equity. It was the one tool to go to foreign nations and say to them, you will open your markets. And they had no choice. A Korea which sends 60% of all of its exports to America, in the face of a Gephardt amendment, had one option: open up their markets. We didn't do it. I hope a future Democratic administration does, but not protectionism. An adjustment to the realities of new markets, new rules in international trade, and finally a strategy to open foreign markets. And if these things don't seem clear, if you don't agree with my analysis, let me suggest to you that one we're going to face in the years when you're in government. Today we're losing to the Koreans and the Japanese and sometimes the Germans in trading products. The fastest increases in steel imports to the United States in the last year weren't from any of those countries. They're from Eastern Europe. As a member of Congress, I went a while ago to Egypt to help sell American helicopters, and because it's an important industry. And we said to the Egyptians, here's our price. They said, well, the Soviets offered us a price for half as much. And they said, well, we told the Soviets that wasn't a good enough price, so they cut it in half again. All the world is not playing by free market capitalist rules. There are people who are prepared to sell steel less than the price of manufacturing. Helicopters, less than the cost of making them. Or in the case of my district with Italy, a country in my district we rarely criticize, they sell pasta for less than the cost of making it because they want the foreign exchange, because trade becomes a public works project, a means of making jobs. That means that if you're going to keep the basic rules of free and fair and open trade, you need a strategy. Our trade bill has tried to define that strategy. And so we can compete in the world with a variety of different economic means and political systems, but do so equally.
We ask Chick Donahue to put the last question.
Congressman, you spoke about the blue-collar workers in your home state that help pay for your education.
God bless them.
As you know, there are fewer blue-collar workers today in America. Most of the new jobs are service jobs. Back in the Carter administration, there was an attempt for a labor law. Do you see any possibility of labor law reform in the future, knowing fully that the majority of those blue-collar workers made a decent wage because they were unionized, and not as many are today?
I think that a first order of business in a Democratic administration is less the reform of labor laws than the enforcement of labor laws. Most of the erosion of the ability to organize and to properly represent and to restrict corporate power over those who are organized or seek to be is because the National Labor Relations Board is not functioning. And there has been a conscious decision that has grown from the time those air controllers were fired that if they did not do so, we couldn't force them to use the law. Most of our labor laws in this country, with a good board, with an honest president, with a decent attorney general, someone who came to the law neutrally, just believing simply in its enforcement, would suffice. I think the question instead has a lot to do with how we want the future of our economy to be and how we envision where it is going. We're fighting today to keep a minimum wage that has lost 30% of its purchase power in the last 10 years. Does anyone in the country still really not understand that the genius of the American economy, its uniqueness, is the ability of those who make products to buy their own products? The threat to our economic health when those people at those wages do not have the means to purchase consumer goods in this country, what that does to this world's largest market, we've lost sight of that. We've lost sight, too, of the fact that you can open up to goods from all around the world, no matter whether they're dumped or under what conditions they're made. But I thought we didn't believe in that. But that's what we're doing. We sit home and we feel good and we feel smug about the fact that there's no child labor laws in America, that you've got to be able to get a rest after a 40-hour week, unless you serve in Congress, that there is a basic pay. But then we import furniture from Thailand made by 12-year-olds, shirts from Korea made by people for 75 cents an hour, who sit in rooms with cotton dust so thick you couldn't see a person across a room. Sure, our trade bill interfered with aspects of international trade. What we tried to do is say that America will not prosper. We will not take advantage of those things. And we will not do it to drive down the living standard of our own people, because that is what has happened. Why are those wages declining? Why is the standard of living falling for blue-collar workers in America? Because we haven't set a floor. There are products I don't want in America. If it is necessary in order for me to get a $8 shirt to have someone work for 75 cents an hour without health benefits or retirement or a safe workplace, I don't want it. And I don't want it in this country. That's the decision we have to make. It means keeping the floor in America economically rising. And it means we have to be honest about the costs of that with our own people. I think people respond to that. And I think they would if we posed the question. It isn't any different than any of the other challenges that I tried to present here this evening. Thank you for having me tonight. Bye-bye. Yeah, sure.
I'll tell him to take additional questions there. Let me make one final announcement. As I said earlier, 1988 graduates of the Kennedy School and their families are welcome to join us for a glass of wine and pick up some information on the Kennedy School Alumni Association. As you know, the alumni are an active part of the school community. Bob will be there to answer questions that you haven't had a chance to put otherwise. And Kathy McLaughlin, who is our new alumni director, will be glad to get suggestions for you about what the Alumni Association does. But say thanks to you and thanks again to a graduate of the class of 1981 for an excellent Class Day speech.